Hello and welcome to my video all about sewing your own comfy top out of knit fabric. It's actually quite a simple construction and it will be a good first project for anyone who isn't used to sewing knit fabrics, such as jersey. The result of this tutorial will be a fairly slouchy style t-shirt shape with a slight batwing profile at the underarms. And if you use a sweatshirt jersey like me, you'll get more of a short sleeve sweater than a t-shirt. Instead of providing a pattern, I'll show you how to make your own very easily, and then how to turn this pattern into a top with an added waistband and some cuffs. It's personal preference what material you use for this and how loose you would like it. This is the kind of pattern you can make over and over with different fabrics or alterations each time. In terms of how long this is going to take, it shouldn't take you more than an afternoon. Right, so in order to follow along, you're going to need some knit fabric, a sewing machine and some matching thread, a fitted t-shirt or even just a t-shirt you like the fit of, a disappearing or magic fabric pen, a ruler and a tape measure, some A3 paper, some tape and a pen or pencil, some regular scissors plus some fabric scissors, an iron and an ironing board, and some sewing pins and clips. If you happen to have a serger or overlocker, then that would be great to use for this project. And if you have a rotary cutter and cutting mat, then those would also come in handy. With regard to the fabric that I'm using, it's a sweatshirt jersey in a mild mustard yellow. I like it because it has some weight to it, so it's warm and has a bit of structure, plus it's fleecy on the back, so it's very cosy. You'll want to use light or medium weight fabric for this so the applied edges don't look too bulky. Also, it should have some drape to prevent it looking stiff or boxy, and you should also pre-wash the fabric. Right, so the first step is to make your own paper template. So tape together A3 paper sheets to make a piece large enough for half of the garment that you're going to make. Then take a fitted t-shirt and lay it out flat on top of the paper, so that just over one half of the t-shirt is on top. Then draw around the outside of this t-shirt with a pen or pencil. Be careful not to move the t-shirt. If you want to add a neckband later, or you just want a slightly wider neckline, then use the lowest inner line of the neckband for your template. Otherwise, you can use the upper line of the neckband. You'll also need to mark the centre point of the t-shirt at the top and bottom. To do this, I measured across the bottom of the t-shirt and marked a point halfway across. I then did the same at the top. This is important because you want this template to represent only half of the t-shirt shape. And the next step is where we add adjustments to this basic outline. Note that the t-shirt I'm using fits me snugly, so I'm using it to represent my body size. If you use a looser fitting t-shirt, just take that into account when adding to the size. Okay, so the adjustments that I made are as follows. I removed 3 inches from the length of the t-shirt outline and drew a new line. This is because I'll be adding a wide waistband later on to replace this removed material. I want to end up with a top approximately the same length as this t-shirt. I also added 1.5 inches to the side seam, from the base to around 4 inches from the underarm. Then I went out to 2 inches. Note that I'm not using a particularly stretchy fabric, but if you are, then you'll need to take that into account when deciding these measurements. There are no rules here, it just depends what fit you want. You'll see that I ended up with a classic fit as a result of these alterations, which means that the top was not snug, but it also was not loose. I decided that I wanted the sleeves to end 7 inches from my underarm, but I also knew I was going to add 3-inch cuffs on the ends of the sleeves. Therefore, I took 3 inches from 7 inches to give me 4 inches, and then measured this distance from the underarm and drew a line. I then joined the side seam to the end of my sleeve with a curve to give that comfy, slight batwing effect. As I mentioned already, I ended up with only a very slight batwing effect under the arm, but you can exaggerate the effect however much you like. You just need to make sure that you have long enough sleeves. I then measured the circumference of my real life arm 4 inches from my underarm, and this was 14 inches. As a result, I made sure the end of the sleeve on the diagram measured 7 inches across. This made my sleeves a snug fit, so if you want more room, feel free to add an extra inch or so. So yeah, that's what I did, but you can alter it as you see fit. For instance, you could make it longer or baggier, or even cut a wider neckline. Once you've finished the template, just go around the final outline with a thicker pen. Also add 1/2 inch seam allowance to the end of the sleeve so that you have a straight section to easily join the cuff to. Then fold or cut the paper along the centre line that marks the middle of the t-shirt. Then cut out the template, making sure that you cut along the back neckline, not the lower front neckline. You now have a perfect half template shape. Next, you need to use this template to cut out the body pieces for the top. So place your template on top of your fabric and draw all around it using a disappearing or magic fabric pen. Make sure you leave enough space for the other half of the t-shirt shape on the flat edge side. An important thing to note is how the stitches in your knit fabric are orientated. So if you look carefully, you should see that there are stitches all over the fabric that look like little V shapes. These little V shapes need to be upright. This will mean that any stretch the fabric has will be widthwise across your fabric pieces. Basically, you want the pieces to stretch left to right rather than up down. Then you need to flip the template over horizontally so that the straight edge lines up with the centre line you've just drawn. Then draw around this shape again. This will give you the full t-shirt body shape. Then cut around the outer line, ignoring the centre line. You then need to use this shape as a template to cut out another identical piece. Note that I'm using a slightly thicker fabric, which is best being cut as a single layer. But if you're using a lightweight fabric, you could cut your 2 body pieces on the fold instead to save time. For the next step, you need to sew these 2 body pieces together. So place them right sides together and pin along the shoulders and along the side seams. Then sew along these pinned edges, using a stretch stitch and a ballpoint needle. If you don't have a stretch stitch option, then you can use a narrow zigzag stitch. If you have a serger, feel free to use that instead. Make sure you backstitch at the beginning and the end, and also make sure you don't sew along the base of the top, or along the neckline, or across the ends of the sleeves. Note that I used a 1/2 inch seam allowance throughout this project. Once you've done that, try on the sewn top to make sure it fits okay, and also mark how low you would like the front neckline to be. Then take off the top, fold the front neckline in half, and cut away the fabric that you don't want there, cutting through both layers at once so the result will be symmetrical. The next step is to cut out the fabric pieces you need for the cuffs. I had already decided that I wanted the finished cuffs to be about 3 inches long, but feel free to change this length to suit you. The width of the cuff pieces will be 2 times whatever length you want, plus 1 inch. So in my case, that was 2 times 3 inches plus 1 inch, which is 7 inches. For the length of the cuff pieces, you'll need to measure around your arm with a tape measure where you want the sleeves to end. In my case, this was around 12 inches. You'll want this cuff to grip onto your arm, so it does need to be relatively snug. I therefore didn't add any more length, not even to account for the seam allowance. If you're not sure you want the cuffs to be a snug fit, make the length of these pieces an inch or so longer, because you can always make them tighter in the next step. Measure out this cuff shape twice on your fabric. and then cut them out. Make sure the fabric stretches parallel to the longer sides of these fabric pieces, i.e. lengthwise. A fun idea might be to make these cuffs and the waistband in a contrasting knit fabric, so that's just a fun option to keep in mind. Then take one of these pieces and fold it in half, short side to short side, making sure that the right sides are facing. Pin the short edges together after lining them up. Then sew with a stretch stitch or serger and use 1/2 inch seam allowance as usual. This will create a tube. Then turn half of this tube right side out to form a double layer ring, like so. Push this tube up your arm to where it will sit on the finished top, in order to see if it fits snugly enough to stay in place. If not, you can reduce the size now by resewing. With the folded edge facing the end of the sleeve, push the sleeve into the centre of the ring. The aim is to have all of the raw fabric edges lining up, and also to have the seam of the ring lining up with the underarm seam. Then pin or clip these edges together. Clip the underarm seams together first, then stretch the armhole to find the point directly opposite that and clip there as well. Then bring these clips together and stretch the armhole again to find the centre points between these clips, and then pin or clip at these 2 points as well. Don't worry if this bit doesn't make much sense, you're basically clipping the 3 layers together at 4 points, each 1/4 of the way around the armhole. And because it's likely that these cuffs are tighter than your sleeves, you'll have some excess fabric on one of the layers. You need to try and space out this excess fabric as evenly as you can. Then sew all around the armhole. I used a slightly longer stretch stitch of 3.5 mm because of the thickness, and I went very slowly over the seams. Note that due to the probable excess fabric on one layer, you'll need to stretch the other 2 layers to match the length of the longer layer, and you need to do this as you sew. I like to stretch and sew each 1/4 of the armhole at a time. This just stops the excess fabric all bunching up and forming little pleats. You then just need to repeat these steps for the other cuff as well. And then we need to add the waistband in a very similar way. And for this you'll need 2 identical pieces of fabric. I wanted the band to be 3 inches wide when finished, so I needed the width of the waistband pieces to be 2 times 3 inches plus 1 inch, which is 7 inches. This is worked out in exactly the same way as the cuff pieces. For the length, it will depend whether you want the waistband to be the same width as the bottom of the top and just hang straight, or whether you'd like the waistband to grip onto your hips or waist. The length, therefore, needs to be somewhere between half of your hip circumference, or wherever your top will come down to, and the width of the bottom of your top, plus 1 inch for seam allowance. In my case, half of my hip circumference is 20 inches, and the width across the bottom of my top so far is 21 inches. So I decided to choose 20 inches to make the waistband have a more snug fit. And then you also need to add 1 inch for seam allowance. So the length of my waistband pieces is 20 plus 1, which is 21 inches. As a result, my waistband will be 1 inch shorter than the bottom edge of my top and will need to stretch a little bit when sewing. Once you know the measurements of the rectangle, which in my case is 7 by 21 inches, you need to cut out 2 of these from your fabric, making sure as usual that the fabric stretches lengthwise. Then place these waistband pieces right sides together and pin along both short edges. Sew along these edges to form a tube. Turn half of this tube right side out, so you now have a double layer ring. Then try out the size and fit of this tube on your own body to see if it's what you want. If it's not, you'll need to resew. Push the bottom of the t-shirt top through the centre of this ring, making sure the raw edges are all lined up along the base. The side seams also need to line up. Then clip the side seams together at each side, and then add a few more clips in between, trying to space out any excess fabric evenly, just like you did for the cuffs. Then sew through all 3 layers of fabric all the way around. If there is any difference between the lengths of the top and the waistband, make sure to stretch the fabric layers that don't have the excess as you sew. The resulting waistband should look like this. The last sewing step is then to finish the neckline. I left my neckline quite high, so I decided I didn't want to add a neckband. Instead, I simply folded 1/2 inch of fabric to the inside, pinned, and then sewed with a stretch stitch, making sure to be as neat as possible. If you do want to add a neckband, you would do this in the same way as you added the cuffs and the waistband. You would likely want the neckband to be about 1 inch wide when finished, so the fabric piece would need to be 2 times 1 inch plus 1 inch, which is 3 inches. The length would be the length of the neckline, which you would find out with a tape measure, minus X, and then plus 1 inch for the seam allowance. X would depend on how stretchy your fabric is, so if it's not very stretchy like mine, you might have X equals 1 inch. If it's pretty stretchy, you might have X equals 2 or 3 inches, and if your fabric is very stretchy, then X might be 4 or 5 inches. So in my case, the neckline is 21.5 inches, and then I would take off 1 inch and then add 1 inch. So the length would be 21.5 inches. You then sew this piece into a tube by joining the short edges, then fold it in half, wrong sides together, line up the raw edges with the raw edges of the neckline, pin and then sew as you did with the cuffs. And finally, you'll just want to press your top with an iron along the seams to give a professional finish. And that's it, the top is now complete. I'm personally very pleased with it, it's very comfy and cosy, and I hope you give this project a go. Thank you very much for watching.